Tonight, we won't trace the marble paths of emperors or recite the victories etched in golden mosaics. Instead, we will follow the city after it exhales when the sun's last light slips behind the domes and the narrow streets begin to breathe differently. Here, shadows are not the absence of light, but another form of it. They cling to arches and linger under balconies as if guarding old secrets. The air is thick with the perfume of warm bread from hidden bakeries, and with the salt of the sea that whispers its own stories to the quay. Somewhere a door closes too softly, and somewhere else another opens without sound. This is the Constantinople you won't find in daytime chronicles, the one where silk whispers behind curtains, and footsteps vanish before you can follow. So lower the lights. Let the stillness of the Nile press gently against your thoughts. And if your breathing begins to follow the slow drift of the river under the moon, that's just the night carrying you with it. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next story will find you there. The heart was the library of the self, the place that remembered every generous thing and every small unkindness. And after death, Anubis would put it on a scale against the feather of Mut, which is an elegant way of saying that anxiety was built into the user manual. People slept with the thought that their heart should be light and tidy, as if a daily housekeeping of feelings were advisable. If you still awake by the time I reach the part about dream prescriptions from temple priests, you can subscribe, or you can let that decision float down the Nile on a little reed boat, and I will keep rowing at a whisper. The word for heart, Ib, did the work that our word mind tries so hard to do. It thought, it chose, it wandered into worries and needed guidance back. Letters carved in limestone asked the heart not to stand as a witness against its owner, which is the most relatable legal advice in any language. A man could be strong, and still his heart might be heavy. A woman could be dutiful, and still her heart might remember something that would trouble the scale. The remedy was not a sudden revelation, but a long practice. Speak truth, feed the poor, pour water for the thirsty. Greet the gods with clean hands and a voice that did not tremble. Somewhere between oath and habit, calm appeared like dew on limestone. Fears took very specific shapes, which helped. A sneeze meant a spirit had noticed you, not all spirits being equally tactful. A bad day could be the result of a hostile glance traveling through the air like a poorly trained pigeon. An ancient note to self might read, very gently, do not attract unnecessary eyes. People wore faience beads the color of dawn because dawn has better manners than dusk. They tied the eye of Horus around the wrist with thread that remembered prayers. They set tiny squatting dwarfs named Bess on bedroom walls to glower cheerfully at nightmares. It is hard to be afraid when a bearded guardian with a lion tail is dedicated to scaring your fears instead. When worries wandered toward the afterlife, the negative confession served as rehearsal. I did not steal bread. I did not cause weeping. I did not listen when it was not my turn. A list like that is not so different from the way modern warriors run through their day at midnight, auditing emails and conversations and deciding to be kinder tomorrow. The difference is that the Egyptians had a feather to picture, and a scale, and the satisfying idea that balance is not only beautiful but measurable. Across the river from certainty stood the business of repair, and repair was unhurried. Healing the spirit could happen in a temple where the stone held coolness, even in late afternoon, and the air smelled of crushed myrtle and burnt resin. A person would bring an ache that had no obvious place in the body, because sadness rarely carries directions, and a priest of Imhotep or another helpful deity would recommend sleep under the god's protection. Incubation, they called it, which sounds like eggs but means a careful night. You bathed, you fasted a little, you set aside noisy thoughts the way a scribe sets aside a blunt reed, and you lay down where the god might visit your dreams with a picture worth interpreting. The next morning, you told your dream with the seriousness it deserved. If a falcon flew toward the east, The prescription might be fresh bread for the poor and a short walk in early light. If water ran clear in the dream, it could be hours by the river with a friend who knows when to keep silence. The temple had its own pharmacy, of course. The papyri list honey, beer, and herbs in combinations that read like calm recipes. Honey soothed more than throats. Beer reminded the anxious that evenings can be persuaded to loosen their shoulders. If the dream had been stubborn or complicated, the priest would write a few neat lines on papyrus, fold it, and tuck it into a little packet to wear, a thought made portable. It is not so different from a note on a phone, except that an amulet never needs charging and never sends you a notification to ruin your nap. Magic was medicine with an indoor voice. Incantations were not shouted. They were spoken as if explaining the obvious to the world. An aching mind had a way of listening in. The Ebers papyrus, which is comfortably long and very sure of itself, suggests mixtures for sadness that include frankincense, smoke, myrrh, and wine, and the kind of words you say in the direction of a kindly god so that the words will come back cleaned. Around necks hung amulets shaped like signs that knew who they were. The scarab promised renewal, a beetle pushing dawn up the horizon like a patient employee. The Waja eye watched bad luck the way a cat watches a fly and rarely missed. The sistrum, a musical rattle, made a silver rainfall of sound for Hathor, and some nights that sound would be the exact right architecture for falling asleep. Herbs traveled too. Sweet rush, mint, and chamomile met in water or beer and taught the evening to be easy. A sensible house might place a little bowl of natron near the door, not because natron is magical, but because clean hands come with small rituals, and rituals are the domesticated cousins of spells. Even writing a name on a potsherd and pressing it to your chest could feel like fastening yourself to the day so it would not run away without you. Palaces had their own drafts and echoes, and in them minds could stumble. A ruler who slept poorly was not merely a person who needed tea. He was a calendar problem, a flood forecast with shoes. Royal anxiety took on ceremonial shapes. Oracles were consulted in courtyards where the shade was opinionated. The bark of a god was carried, rocked, turned, its movement treated as speech. Answers arrived in motion the way some answers arrive now in the walk we take when a room is too small for the question. The court had physicians called Swanra who knew how to arrange poultices on actual wounds and how to prescribe order for invisible ones. They spoke the language of heke-effective words, not stage tricks, and the language of the mechu, the channels that carry breath, blood, and sometimes trouble. If a king's heart was heavy, the prescription could be music in the cool hours, or hunting in measure, or an afternoon before the shrine of a favored ancestor. Because remembering you belong to a line is often the beginning of remembering that you belong to yourself. If you are wondering whether a pharaoh ever called in sick, there are days in the annals that are suspiciously quiet, and the sun managed to rise anyway, perhaps because the staff were very dependable. Court doctors enjoyed remedies that now sound like small, well-meaning experiments. A sachet of fragrant seeds tied under a chair so that thought would sit down. A glaze of honey at the tongue to persuade speech to be sweet to the speaker as well as to the listener. A paste of lettuce, which had an entire public relations department in the Nile Valley, because it stood upright and oozed an opinion about fertility that poets found terribly convenient. Massage with warmed oil, not too scented, because scent can be bossy. A hymn recited at the doorway, so that crossing the threshold felt like moving into better weather. When the worry did not loosen, the physicians wrote referrals to priests of particular gods, because specialization exists even in ages that loved generalists. The Edwin Smith text, which is very practical and a little proud of it, noticed that a blow to the head can change how a person speaks, which is only 1 inch away from admitting that the head has something to do with speech. Egyptians still kept the heart in the position of chief executive, but they were observant employees in the brains department. The treatments for confusion, melancholy, or fear were not miracle claims. They were nudges, gentle instructions to the day. Breathe differently, sleep in a temple, wear this sign, pour water before the statue of your grandmother, who has become an excellent listening spirit. The streets had their own weather systems. In the records from the village of Deir al-Medina, the coffins builders and wall painters kept notes that looked suspiciously like late-night texts. The ration deliveries were delayed. The mayor listened and then pretended not to hear. The men went on strike in a way that historians love to point to as first and everyone else recognizes as ordinary. We're hungry. They wrote on a straka with brushes that had leftover paint on them, and we were sitting down. Sitting is an effective political technology and an effective mental health technique. There were debts to manage and bosses whose patience had measurable lengths. Soldiers wrote home with the same shy complaints that soldiers write now. The food is either too much or not enough. The officers have perfected an interested silence. The nights are full of other men's dreams. Scribes complained about eyes and backs, the way scribes always do, and sometimes they wrote quick poems in the margins about how being a scribe is better than being a brickmaker, which is almost always true, but still feels like a management memo disguised as verse. Market noise can be a symptom and a cure. If you stood very still, you could hear the fishmongers chant form a steady line under the day, like a low kindness. Stress traveled with festivals too, because even joy needs logistics. Beer must be brewed, bread baked in its careful molds, with the fingertips pressed in like signatures, garlands strung without tangling, boats painted with ropes that look correctly coiled, because boats notice these things. Families brought ancestors along in the form of little stele and conversations at graves that were not sad, exactly, but thorough. Letters to the dead survive, written with the exact tone of someone emailing support. Please tell Aunt so-and-so to stop making complaints in my dreams. Also, if you could fix the matter of the land boundary, that would be appreciated. This is not madness. This is a stable social network that includes helpful ghosts. If a house felt heavy, someone might sweep from back to front and say a line from a learned book. Out you go, dust of bad luck, and then set a pot of water to boil with herbs inside, because steam has beliefs. At dusk, the city smelled like bread and river, and a little like incense, and a little like goats. Men who had been loud all day grew tired in a way that made them pleasant. Women who had decided everything all day finally decided to sit. The mind noticed it was being carried and decided to be carried. Love had its own medicines and its own fevers, recorded in poems that look modern if you squint. A girl says, I met him by the canal and I forgot my name. I am like a house with the door open. A boy says, I cannot eat because she is late like the 5th hour of day when one expects the 6th. There are charms for encouraging love that involve knots tied with correct optimism and little cakes shaped like the idea of luck. There are also charms for discouraging it, which are the same knots untied with a sigh. In the letters of households, you can watch people negotiating absences, writing the word health with extra ink, as if the word could be contagious in a good way. When someone died, the speeches were organized for usefulness. The deceased is talked to as if present, because presence is a useful fiction that becomes true by insistence. Singers with harps stood in tomb chapels and sang Carpe Diem with a pharaonic accent. Make holiday, no one takes their things with them. Follow your heart as long as you live, which is psychologically sound advice coming from a carved musician in a stone room. Loneliness hid in plain sight in the bureaucracy, which prefers tidy numbers to quiet aches. But you can read it in small places. A man signs for 20 loaves and adds 3 dots after his name, the ancient punctuation for yes, I know. A woman preparing offerings to a household god writes on the pot what she hopes, that her child will sleep without the nightmare of crocodiles, and that her husband will be less precise in the matter of reproaches. The gods in clay nodded. They have always had excellent bedside manners. Cats help more than their fair share by being warm and satisfied with small talk. Dogs helped by reminding people about mornings. The river helped by being the river, which is to say it went past steadily without judging anyone's thoughts, and when the mind found itself. Getting loud, a person could sit on a step and let the current do a kind of counting. Even the sun, which is rather dramatic in most myths, performed an ordinary therapy by leaving and returning on time. The brain was not yet the president of the body, but the Egyptians noticed it when it misbehaved. Head trauma recorded on papyrus produced speech that is no longer straight, vision that is two opinions at once, legs that pretend the floor is a suggestion. The recommended treatment was observation and patience and bandages that admit they are trying. For the troubles that arrived without visible cause, the treatment was community shaped into ritual. A neighbor who bakes will send bread that is as good as a sentence. A sister who has 3 jokes will tell 2 and save 1 for the morning. A priest who knows the old stories will retell the one where the goddess got thirsty for beer in the world, was saved by making the beer look like blood and pouring it into sand, which is merely a folk way of saying that panic can be confused into relaxation with sweetness and color and a willingness to sleep. Anxiety's favorite color was probably the same as the river at noon. It is restful to imagine that. A calm mind in Thebes or Memphis expected to be maintained the way a house expects to be swept. You would not remove dust once and declare victory. You would not tie one amulet and retire it with honors. The feather waited, the scale waited, and between those two waiting things, a whole civilization practiced being moderately decent and moderately kind, which is a robust form of therapy. When something went wrong, you asked a god with a practical reputation. When nothing obvious was wrong and still the noise was present, you listened to a harp song written by someone who had learned that a human being is a bottle with a clever cork. You drank a beer that had been responsible at the brewery. You slept in a temple that smelled of stone and forgiveness. You wore a sign on a string because a sign on a string can make the day click into place like a lid. You wrote to your dead and asked them to help carry a small corner of your worry, and they did, or at least you slept. So the mental weather of ancient Egypt was not a storm so much as a calendar. There were cool days of order when the ape sat quietly in the chest and counted blessings on its 10 fingers. There were hot, fussy days when the ib rehearsed speeches to the scale. There were clever days when a scribe drew a little beast in the margin and found that courage takes very little space. And through all of it, the river moved as if pulling thought along. Sen polished the edges of wishes so the wishes would not bruise the hands. Incense rose and reminded noses that air can be educated, and the temples kept their doors open to sleepers because sleep has always been a god with helpful opinions. If you drift off now, the feather can keep watch for a while, and the heart can remember only the light things until morning, which is the sort of negotiation that even a serious jackal-headed judge would allow with a small, approving smile. You might not expect a nation's mail to depend on boiled plants and polite teeth, but for a long time, the speed of correspondence hinged on gum Arabic and a willingness to lick. Before stamps, a sender folded the letter into its own envelope and tied or sealed it with wax that explained itself in a small, important circle. Payment was due at the other end, which meant that a letter could arrive as a gift and a bill at the same time. The stamp fixed that. It was a tiny promise that the journey had already been paid for, a square of paper that said, "Please do not worry about money anymore. There is only distance to consider." The problem was how to attach the promise to the envelope in a manner that would endure rain. Pockets and a sorting clerk with opinions. Enter the gum. Gum Arabic is the sap of acacia trees, dried into beads the color of mild honey, and convinced that water will always live it. Dissolved and brushed onto the back of a sheet of printed stamps, it formed a film that waited patiently. It was the kind of patience you can taste. If you re still awake by the time we reach perforation gauges and the correct way to soak a commemorative issue, Feel free to subscribe or don't. The gum is already dry and content either way. Early recipes read like desserts that changed their minds. Dextrin caramelized, starch brought smoothness and a faint toastiness that no one mentioned but everyone knew. Fish glue arrived when budgets were stern. It worked, and it smelled like decisions. Casein from milk had its own philosophy and preferred a cool climate. Stationers stirred the mix in big copper pans, watching for the moment when liquid turned from conversation to agreement. Sizing rollers whispered across sheets and left behind a shine that was not a shine so much as a future. The back of a stamp is a modest landscape, a shimmer, a hint of grain from the paper, the ghost of the design if you hold it to light. In winter, postmasters worried about cracking. In summer, they worried about sticking. To prevent a stack of stamps from becoming a marriage, workers dusted the gum with fine starch or chalk so the sheets would not fall in love with one another too quickly. Some post offices kept the sheets slightly curved on wooden racks the way bakers cool biscuits, because humidity believes in ambush. And then there were the human tongues, which are capable of recognizing adhesives more accurately than nostrils ever could. Old catalogs speak in the driest tone of sweet gum and bitter gum and flavored gum, the quotation marks doing all the emotional labor. The first stamps had to be separated by hand, with scissors and patience, and enough daylight to believe in straight lines. Clerks developed a touch for cutting close without committing the small violence of altering the design. Rouletting arrived as an improvement, little cuts instead of holes, dashes of permission, but perforation was the system's favorite child. Picture a row of needles, a comb of tidy aggression, rising and falling through paper like a machine that dreams of lace. Holes make chads, and chads fall like polite snow under the perforator's table, and paper dust sits on boots that never expected glamour. There are two main philosophies: line perforation, which works row by row and column by column like a patient gardener, and comb perforation, which takes 3 sides at once and feels optimistic about efficiency. The difference is a tiny thing that becomes a hobby. The corners look a little different. The rhythm of the holes whispers which machine did the work. Collectors speak of gauge, how many holes fit in 2 centimeters, as if it were a language that also tells the weather. 10 is generous, 14 is tidy, odd numbers are anecdotes. Somewhere a clerk turned a small metal wheel against a stamp edge and nodded because the wheel sat what the eye already enjoyed. Everywhere stamps acquired local habits. In damp places the gum ended up heavier, a glassy sheet that cracked like a distant pond if you bent it. In dry places the gum barely whispered and then disappeared like polite advice. A few countries experimented with violet-tinted adhesive that made the backs look as if they were remembering sunsets. Some used unusual paper, blued paper that had iron in its soul, wove paper that wore its texture honestly, laid paper that carried faint wire lines like timetables. All of this mattered because correspondence is a social animal. A stamp is a handshake. The paper is the room where the handshake happens. The gum is the willingness to be present. And if you pressed your tongue to the back and felt a sweetness that remembered acacia groves in far climates, you were participating in a small, edible treaty between trees and distance. The post office itself sounded like punctual furniture. In the morning, the clerk counted sheets. The perforations clicked like well-dressed insects, and the brass stamp racks flashed their accuracy. Letters arrived in sacks that smelled like wool and weather, and the canceling machine chewed gently, turning future into past with a circle that said where and when. The stamp and the postmark together are a pair that enjoys their marriage. One pays, the other remembers. Sometimes the cancel missed and left a perfect stamp free to dream of reuse, and the postal inspector frowned, and the clerk repaired the omission with a tidy black. X drawn by hand, the kind of gesture that makes rules feel personal. There were ink pads that grew dry and were coaxed back with a few drops of stewardship daters with small, Rubber bands for months that behaved like theater companies, always rehearsing, never quite finished, and the smell of envelopes, like cereals that had learned to be responsible. If you worked long enough among stamps, you could hear the room's tempo, the soft slap of letters stacked into bundles, the sigh of twine, the little cough a canvas bag makes when it remembers it is full. Perforation accidents became folklore. Sometimes the comb was fed at a slant and the holes wandered into the design. The result was an error that delighted everyone except the person who had to explain it to a supervisor. Sometimes the rows drifted apart and a rail of unperforated paper remained between two stamps, and collectors called it a gutter and grew conversational. There were imperforate between pairs that looked like two friends holding hands, and line shifts that made the corners into tiny staircases. And once in a while, the machine forgot to perforate on one side at all, leaving a stamp with a straight edge where there should be teeth, which is a personality type in philately as in life. The machines were forgiving to a point, but paper has moods and factory floors have drafts, and the needle bars could be sullen on Monday mornings. A good operator learned to listen for the tone that meant paper was traveling with its shoulders square. Eventually, the gum decided that human tongues deserved a sabbatical. Self-adhesive stamps arrived as a quiet revolution, first in climates that made licking feel like a wet weather sport, then everywhere mail wanted to avoid mess. The backing paper learned to release with a sigh. A corner peeled up with the small pleasure of a new notebook's first page. The adhesives were thoughtful polymers that never pretended to taste like trees, and for that reason they were considered modern. Old albums weren't sure what to do with them. Stamp hinges, the little folded gummed scraps that hold a stamp lightly to a page, didn't. T-grip the slick back kindly and mounts with clear fronts learned to be a better idea. The first generation of self-adhesives even made soaking difficult, which led to long bath rituals in kitchens where people debated dish soap like philosophers. Post offices adjusted with the patience they showed to all novelties. Coils for vending machines kept feeding out neat serpents of stamps, booklets tucked into pockets like well-behaved sandwiches, and panes arrived die-cut with little peaks in place of holes, simulated perforations that looked like teeth drawn by a careful child. Meanwhile, catalog writers kept inventing adjectives that are mostly tempos. Mint means untouched, unhinged, the gum an untraveled road. Lightly hinged means someone visited and closed the door behind them. Heavily hinged means a relative stayed too long. No gum means history happened. Never hinged is a phrase so pure it almost floats. Original gum is a promise wrapped in nostalgia. Regumed is a promise wrapped in cautionary tales. A collector learns to tilt a stamp under light and look for brushstrokes in the adhesive, the way an art historian looks for a painter's hand. Some countries gummed only the gummed part, leaving margins bare for sanity. Others gummed everything in sheet selvage curls like a philosophy left in a warm room. The back of a stamp is a map for people who prefer very small geographies. The front, of course, does the waving and the portraits, but the back is where the relationship lives. Children discover this when they soak stamps off envelopes for the first time. There is a bowl made of something indestructible and warm water, and a pile of clippings with corners that still remember letter knives. The stamps relax into the water, one by one, like modest divers. After a minute, the paper releases with a slow politeness, and the stamp floats free. A small boat with color for sails. You fish it out with tweezers that refuse to scratch, lay it upside down on a towel, and press it under a heavy book that has never expected to be a press. The next day, each little square is flat and prim, the gum a memory you can still see as shine. In albums, spaces wait like parking places with captions: king, bird, bridge, famous economist who looks like your uncle, hinges fold, tongues of paper in miniature. Mounts crackle on the edge, where a stamp slides in with a sound that suggests agreement. At some point, you read the phrase, dead country, Undiscover it means a nation that no longer issues stamps under that name, which makes the album feel like a history book that prefers tiny rectangles to paragraphs. Postmarks tell their own soft jokes. The circular date stamp that lands with an official smooch on the corner of an image sometimes finds itself in the middle of a face, creating a mustache that no one intended. Slogan cancels remind the world to buy war bonds or floss or attend a festival that surely had lemonade. Wavy lines hum across the picture like white noise for stationery. Some offices used killer cancels that are nothing but lines, living up to the name without malice. Railway post offices had their own markings, little moving cities that sorted while swaying, the clerks memorizing the names of towns the way actors memorize lines, quick and without the burden of doubt. A letter could travel across a continent with 3 black circles and a smear that looks like weather. You can read the journey in smudges the way a geologist reads cliffs slowly and with a personality that fears no afternoon. In quieter corners of the hobby, people keep glassines filled with duplicates that will someday become generosity. They trade by weight, called kiloware, which is delightfully imprecise. A kilogram of other people's mail is like a bag of tidied confetti. Somewhere inside is a stamp that will answer a question you did not know how to ask. Old approvals packets, the mail order precursor to online everything, arrive from time to time in shoeboxes. The slips marked with pencil for cost and crossed out in another pencil for kindness. At club tables in church basements, long red boxes hold country after country, each separated by hand-lettered dividers that make the alphabet feel like a patient machine. A bell announces the raffle. Someone wins tongs with decorative tips. Everyone claps in a way that sounds like paper learning optimism. No one is in a hurry. No one ever is in a church basement about stamps. The science quietly underwrites the charm. Paper expands when wet. Gum contracts when dry. Perforations relieve stress the way park benches relieve pedestrians. Adhesives prefer clean surfaces and lose confidence on envelopes that have known rain. Light fades inks with the persistence of summer. Albums protect with a mutter. Acrylic mounts outlast PVC mounts and never say a word about it. Acid-free paper is a small shield against time's fondness for yellow. A black background makes colors look like they're telling the truth. A watermark detector is a tray with fluid that temporarily shows what the paper remembers, and it feels like magic even when you know it is surface tension performing in a reasonable tone. Occasionally, there is a stamp with no gum at all because it was issued that way, to save money or because the postal service did not trust people to gum and then dry at scale. Such stamps are a philosophical test. Is a stamp still a stamp if it expects glue to come from elsewhere? Yes, stamps are agreement given shape. GUM is a convenience. Once in a while, you find an old envelope where the sender overdid the licking and the back of the stamp shines like melted sugar, and you think of a kitchen with a kettle and a deadline. Once in a while, you find a sheet that stuck to another sheet for a century and separated only recently with the help of a conservator who spoke softly to water. The story is not dramatic. It is a series of small corrections that end with a square of paper being free again. If you step back from all the tiny rectangles, you can see an ordinary house practicing extraordinary patience. A desk holds a pane of stamps under a paperweight that once held down grocery lists. A drawer keeps a perforation gauge and a magnifier that turns heads of state into people with pores. A kettle earns its keep by providing soaking water that is not too hot and not too proud. A heavy book becomes a press and, surprisingly, enjoys it. The album pages lie open like measured fields and accept newcomers in their quiet way. Outside, a mailbox lifts its red flag like an eyebrow and waits for something small that means a lot to leave, and something small that means a lot to arrive. The entire system is a choreography of gummed patience and perforated optimism, perforations being merely agreements to be separated cleanly when the time comes. You might think this is an old choreography that has forgotten the steps. Now that bells leap through the air invisibly and birthday wishes travel as glowing words. But every day, even now, a clerk peels a self-adhesive stamp from its paper and presses it onto an envelope with a thumb that has learned consistency. Somewhere a child learns that soaking stamps brings quiet, and that tweezers with spoon-shaped tips perform tiny rescues without leaving scars. Somewhere a collector tilts a stamp in light and sees the gum flash and thinks, yes, there you are, little proof that trees cooperate with distances. Somewhere a letter arrives carrying only one important sentence and a stamp that did the good work of getting it there. The envelope is opened with care. The stamp survives. The day feels slightly more organized than it did before. If you are drifting now, imagine a counter at closing time. The daters are turned to tomorrow and left to think about it. The last sheet of commemoratives slides into a drawer that smells of paper and oil. A few chads cling to the floor like punctuation and will be swept up in the morning. The rack stands tidy and a little proud. On the wall, a poster shows a stamp with a bridge on it, and the bridge shows a river, and the river remembers sap that once became gum, and then became attachment, and then became the feeling of arrival. The lights go down one by one. The room takes a breath that sounds like a bag being tied, and the door clicks with the kind of certainty adhesives always wanted. Tomorrow, there will be more small squares, more dates, more envelopes that briefly become promises under a thumb. The history of stamp gum is not dramatic, but it continues every afternoon, in quiet rooms where distance is solved with water and patience and the gentle confidence of sticky backs. You might not expect a city's peace of mind to depend on a man with a ladder and a pocket full of tiny mantles, but for a long time evening arrived only when lamplighters said it could. They walked out from depots that smelled faintly of rope and matches and Monday, pushing a handcart with a step ladder folded on top like a polite insect. Each carried a staff with a hook, a wick trimmer, and a little igniter at the end that made a modest spark when squeezed, as if fire should be treated like a colleague. On paper, the route looked practical streets in a tidy sequence, numbers that behaved, but the real plan lived in the lamplighter's shoes. He knew which lamp soaked in rain, which one sat higher than its neighbors as if it had opinions about traffic, which had a cracked glass pane that gave the flame a fashionable draft. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part about clockwork valves and the correct angle to polish a globe without making passers-be aware that you are polishing, feel free to subscribe or simply set the idea gently on the curb like a folded ladder. I will keep walking the route in a voice that does not hurry. The work began at civil twilight, which is the civilized kind of dusk that lets you read a timetable if you insist. The lamplighter stopped at each post, tilted the ladder into its favorite notch, climbed 3 careful rungs, lifted the little door, and persuaded a small flame into responsibility. He trimmed, he adjusted, he watched the flame settle into a steady teardrop that understood what a neighborhood expects of light. Gas made it all possible and also a little theatrical. Mains ran under the streets like shy rivers, and each lamp drew a thread of this invisible stuff up through a bonnet to the burner, which was a small garden of holes designed to turn whispering fuel into polite brightness. The earliest burners were open flames, but cities learned about Welsbach mantles, delicate woven bags that glowed like modest moons when heated and demanded handling that could only be described as careful. Friendship. A fresh mantle looked like a tiny sock made by a very formal spider. The lamplighter burned it once to ash so that it became a pale, rigid shell, and then he was gentle for the rest of its life. Some posts had pilot jets so you could light by touching flame to flame. Some had no such luxury and relied on the spark tool. Many had both because redundancy is the city's way of preventing apologies. The light itself was a little warm in color, the kind that flatters brick and forgives paint. It pooled under the glass like tea in a round cup, and then spilled onto cobbles and front steps until cats were persuaded to travel by confidence. House numbers regained their self-esteem. Pavement remembered it had edges. The lamplighter stepped back to look, not to admire, but to confirm that wind and fuel had agreed on terms. Schedules were formal but not rigid. In winter, the rounds began when breath made small fogs. In summer, the job was done in a shirt that knew the day had been ambitious. A brass plate on each post might carry a number that was also a story. Depots kept books listing which post had which temperament. No, 17 mantle shatters in east wind, a note might say, or no, 32 glass missing clip. Mind the hinge. The lamplighter's bag carried spare mantles and folded paper envelopes that rustled the way carefulness rustles. He carried glass cleaner in a bottle that had no label because everyone already knew what it was. He carried a short hand broom for persuading spiders to relocate in a civil way. Some lamps had reflectors inside their bonnets, polished metal that asked the light to be directional and not vain. When rain came on quickly, brim, hat, and cape turned drops into conversation, and the work continued because darkness is punctual. In very grand districts, the posts wore finials like small crowns and expected the light to arrive as ceremony. In plainer streets, the posts were iron that remembered the foundry and liked being useful. The lamplighter did not discriminate. He treated every flame as if it could fail a little without help. As darkness collected in corners, the city transformed into measured ovals of certainty. Each pool of light excluded only the anxieties that preferred edges. People timed their walks by the posts, from no 12 to no. 20 is 3 minutes if you are calm, 2 if it rains, 1 if you are carrying a loaf you would rather keep dry. Policemen, watchmen, and watchful neighbors used the lamps as punctuation marks in their reports. Lovers maintained that the lamps made everyone look interesting, and as a historical claim, this demands little verification. Shopkeepers kept a key to the nearest post if they were trusted. A trusted shopkeeper is a kind of auxiliary lamplighter in any century. There were mornings 2 rounds in reverse when flame met snuffer and the city practiced the art of ending an hour. The last lamp, the one nearest the depot, gave up its glow just as the sky decided to write the day in pale blue ink. The lamplighter counted his mantles, wiped his tools, hung his jacket where jackets dry, and made a note about no 17 that would be read and nodded at, and then left to improve itself tomorrow. Gaslight had a branch office and maintenance. The mantles did not last forever. A sharp vibration could shatter them into the kind of dust that remembers being cloth. You learned to climb like a poem rhythmic without surprises. Glass chimneys broke not often, but occasionally, and each replacement pane tried to pretend it had always been present. The burners clogged with city, a blend of air, patience, and soot. A wire brush corrected them while the lamplighter hummed something that had the tempo of brushing. In neighborhoods near the river, salt remembered to corrode the hinges unless hinges were reminded of oil. In districts near parks, moths offered themselves to light like compliments that are nearly sincere. Every few weeks, the main valves at the base received a twist to remind them they were part of the system. Now, and then a careless wheel sent a bumper into a post, and the whole contraption leaned until someone important noticed, which could take a day or 15 years depending on the budget. The lamplighter, seeing the lean, wedged a wooden prop between post and reality so the evening would not tilt with it. Many propped lamps became local characters. Children used them for directions, turn left at the polite drunk, and for climbing exercises that ended with someone being told to come down because heights are better when you re-30 and paid for it. Electricity arrived like a younger colleague with very specific ideas. The posts did not necessarily change their clothes. Many kept their iron hats and just swallowed wires instead of gas. Bulbs replaced mantles, globes replaced chimneys, fuses replaced the kind of shrug that gas makes when wind misbehaves. Some lamps gained clocks of a mechanical persuasion, round brass brains hiding in the base, their weights slowly descending inside a tube like patient opinions. At sunset, the clock completed a circuit with a decisive click, and the light came on as if the city had made a promise. Later, photocells took over the work, the little glass eyes mounted on the bonnet, like thoughtful barnacles that watch the sky and like to act exactly twice a day. There were whole episodes where timers were set badly, and the lights woke in daylight and slept at night, which made the lamplighters, whose title had now become electric lighting technicians, shrug in a way that contained a toolbox. You could walk a street and see a mixture of histories. One post had a mantle, one a bulb one, a cerium lamp that colored the night like T1, a metal halide lamp that turned faces a sort of honest gray, and the next already held an LED that lived very long with very little drama. Even among electrons, care continued. Glass still smudged. Lenses still collected municipal fingerprints. Spiders stayed employed. Wiring wanted tightness without strain. Gaskets wanted to be replaced before they learned to leak. Crews and vans now made the rounds with lift buckets rather than ladders, but the angle of approach to a lamp remained an artistry. A well-chosen cloth and a steady wrist could turn a globe from vague to crystalline in 3 circles. The inventory lists grew digital, and No 17 became a dot on a map with a history that could be read at lunch. Complaints logged at call centers resolved into jobs. Night cycling, lamp buzzing, lamp out entirely, lamp on continuously, lamp playing at strobe and wind. Strobes are for clubs. Streets prefer continuity. LED drivers, which are the quiet colleagues that keep diodes calm, sometimes grew nervous in heat and were replaced with relatives who had better self-control. Where gas remained, in old squares and along nostalgic canals, technicians knew how to step back into older shoes. They still carried mantles and envelopes. They still carried the right impatience for glass that refused to stay clear. They lit openings for festivals with a pole that sparked like a firm handshake. There were small rituals at the margins of the work. New posts arrived bandaged in cardboard and hope. The protective wrap came away in long strips that made a nice sound, and the fresh paint underneath was the exact color of municipal optimism. Numbers were stenciled with a template that enjoyed being precise. The paint dried with the self-respect of a correct digit. Every few years, the department decided that black was better than green, or green better than black, and an entire boulevard tried on a new jacket without changing its posture. Crews painted bases while the lamps were still burning, which looked reckless from far away and tidy from near. Birds left opinions that were removed with a solution whose label had more warnings than sentences. People asked questions from the sidewalk. How much does a lamp weigh? Do they explode? What happens when lightning makes introductions and received answers shaped like reassurance? Lightning, for its part, prefers tall friends, and the posts wore conductors like invisible raincoats that guided electricity politely into the earth where it could go on being interesting without bothering anyone. In the record books, night length plotted itself like a patient graph. December requested more work. June gave a few evenings off. The dates of spring forward and fall back, those gymnastics of clocks, required a flurry of resets until technology learned to take care of itself. And then there was a calm with occasional phone calls from the one timer that resented instructions. Snow made the light look deeper. Fog lapped at it like a contented dog. In heat, insects held conventions in the halo, and later confused their own minutes with history. The human eye learned the local photometry. Under sodium, people looked like sepia photographs that had committed to the bit. Under LED, whites were white again, and red cars regained their ability to be red after midnight. In some places, a careful compromise arrived. Warm white that flattered brick and skin at once. A few posts were afforded dimming schedules that lowered intensity after midnight, the illumination equivalent of whispering. There were debates about stars and safety. In truth, the city likes to be both visible and gentle. and technicians enjoy making charts that let each block choose its version of that sentence. Long before manuals, towns had night watch. They carried lanterns that were essentially personal streetlights and called the hour out not for the clockless, but for themselves, a way of proving that time was not sneaking past while they patrolled. Those lanterns eventually hung on posts at corners where gossip paused to check its pockets. The shift to public light standardized a detail we now overlook, the idea that darkness should be organized into statements. The posts told you where you are the way mile markers do, quietly and with the authority of repetition. The lamplighters' rounds reinforced the city as claim that it could make any hour hospitable with enough tiny suns. When festival nights arrived, strings of temporary lamps crossed squares and turned them into rooms, and people moved through the rooms to find each other, as if walls were made of air and attendance. There have been experiments and fashions. There were prismatics, globes with faceted glass that bent light into a broader kindness. There were globes shaped like tulips, acorns, spheres, hats, and the occasional inexplicable pineapple. There were fluted columns pretending to be ancient, and slender poles pretending to be modern, and wooden posts that made sense near a harbor where wood is practical and iron is prideful. There were lights under bridges that allowed water to become a participant in night. There were bollards that insisted that ankles deserved consideration. There were dawn sensors tuned so tightly to brightness that a passing flashlight could wake an entire alley, which led to adjustments in an alley that learned to trust only the sky. There were brackets that held flower baskets and also encouraged starlings. Brackets are generous like that. City departments wrote standards that read like long lullabies lumens per square meter. Uniformity ratios, glare indices, each number a promise that the street would not shout. People remember the lamplighter as a figure almost mythic, a walking guarantee with a brass key, and the memory is accurate even if the details have parted company with the century. Children would run behind and try to keep pace with the latter shadows. Sometimes they were given the small mercy of lighting one post under supervision, and later in life these children would look at any switch and feel it slightly ceremonial. In some towns, the lamplighter also wound turret clocks, which is a compatible profession. Both require a relationship with time, and both involve a human being telling mechanisms that the day is not over yet. There were superstitions as hands-on as the job: never leave a lamp half-lit. Do not whistle on the ladder. Always check the second burner, even if the first looks trustworthy. If someone tipped with a coin, it went into a pocket that had collected years of identical coins and never gotten noisy about it. If someone tipped with words, "Thank you for the light," that went into the place people keep the reasons they do such work. What the lamp does to stone is its own chapter. Facades that appear ordinary at noon become bar-leaf at night. Mortar lines draw themselves. Window lintels try on importance. Trees step forward as silhouettes, and then, if a branch crosses the globe, step backward and pretend not to have been caught. A single post can make a corner look like a painting that apologizes for being realistic. Rain under light breaks into fractions. Snow makes halos grow. Leaves find excuses to shine, even the shy ones. Pavement glints where wheel tracks have taught it to be polished. Shop glass reflects the lamp, which reflects the shop, and you can stand between them and be reflected into the bargain. The result is a city that agrees that night is not a vacancy, but a gently different shift. By morning, many lamps are still on, just barely, the way candles remember their duties after the song is over. Photocells register day and give permission to rest. A few stubborn posts keep glowing into breakfast until a technician investigates and discovers a spider had occupied a sensor and declared permanent eclipse. A problem solved by a polite relocation with a soft brush. The equipment enjoys being right most of the time and being corrected now and then. Machines have personalities to the extent that people give it to them by noticing. At the depot, notes become orders. Orders become routes. Routes become evenings that someone will not think about until they walk home and the pools of light are exactly where they expect. If you were drifting, imagine the last street on the list. The lamplighter lifts the little door, or the electrician opens the bonnet, or the photocell makes a decision, depending on which century your thoughts prefer. The flame steadies. The filament glows. The diodes agree. A moth rehearses a small ballet that has never once reached its second act. Someone steps from a bus and finds their keys without performing the dramatic pat-down. A cat chooses the lit side of the path because it knows theater. The house numbers exhale. The officer walking beats pauses under a globe to write in a notebook that believes weather is relevant. The pool of light hums very gently, if at all. You can stand in this pool and look at neighboring pools and see the city thinking in ellipses. When you move, the ellipses overlap, and the overlap is the safest place in the world because it is where the route will always pass again. Tomorrow, someone will come back with a ladder or a bucket truck or simply a pencil to mark that no. 17 finally received a new clip and has stopped being temperamental. A glass pane will be wiped, and the day will be improved by a circle someone else will never identify. Somewhere a museum will maintain a few gas posts for festivals, and tourists will take pictures of the way. The flame breathes, and a guide will explain mantles with the tone of a person introducing an old friend who still writes letters by hand. Somewhere, a modern lamp will dim itself at 2 in the morning and brighten again at 4, because that is what the street wants. The work is not dramatic, but it is continuous. Evening needs attendance, and cities, it turns out, rest best when small, regular lights speak softly on their behalf. If sleep has already arrived and you have missed half the route, that is fine. The lamps will keep the rest of the hours in order, and the morning will discover that everything is where it should be, including you. You might not expect a kingdom's memory to fit on pieces of hazelwood, but for centuries, that is where England kept its promises. A tally stick looked like a twig that had been promoted. Clerks chose straight lengths of seasoned wood, scored them with notches in a code that liked regular shapes, and then split the stick down the middle so that each half carried the same story and mirror. One half was the stock, kept by the exchequer. The other half was the foil, sent away with the person who had paid or owed, or otherwise participated in arithmetic. Bring the halves together and the notches align like geese returning to a river. No ink was necessary, no signature argued. The wood itself remembered. If you are still awake by the time we get to the different widths of notches for pounds, shillings, and pence, feel free to subscribe or let the idea sit in a drawer with old receipts. I will go on splitting sticks at a very considerate pace. The charm of the system was its quiet cleverness. 2 halves meant 2 witnesses. Wood swelled and shrank with weather, but never in a way that allowed forgery to be comfortable. A dishonest knife could copy the pattern of cuts, but could not restore the grain where the split had passed. Under a clerk's thumb, a stick was a lock and a key that had grown up together. Notches were not random scratches, but a polite language of widths and angles. A broad V-bite across the face of the stick meant a pound. A narrower bite meant a shilling. Tiny teeth for pence looked like careful indecision. For very large amounts, there were long cuts down the side, and the whole arrangement added up like a wooden abacus that did not roll away. The sticks were often labeled with names cut into the surface, not with ink, but with a knife as quiet handwriting, and sometimes with little chamfers at the ends, so fingertips would know where to start reading. Clerks sat at a checkered table, hence exchequer counting counters, on squares, and then reaching for a length of hazel that had been waiting politely all morning to become evidence. The room sounded like arithmetic done in a workshop, a murmured total, the scratch of a knife, the soft split of wood that had decided it was time to be 2. In inventories, you will find bundles of tallies tied up with string that learn to be patient, their ends labeled like loaves on market day. The sticks were not pretty and did not apologize. They were practical relics, even while they were new, as if they understood that posterity would love them for being so certain and so quiet. A day with tallies began with a clerk checking yesterday's bundle, tapping each stick gently against the desk as if to ask, "Still you?" The bundle replied by being exactly the same size. Petitioners and sheriffs and tax farmers came in with their foils from the shires, the halves that had been traveling in saddlebags alongside bread and rain. The clerk took the foil, read the notches, and compared it to the stock kept in the department's own pile. When the halves mated, they made a satisfying reunion, the edges and grains sitting together like a sentence finding its verb. If the fit was good, the clerk nodded, a quiet ceremony that passed for celebration, and tied the reunited pair with thread before separating them again for storage, because the system preferred redundant safety to romance. On some days, a stick arrived with a feather or a blob of wax attached by previous hands, a traveler's improvisations in the art of identification. The exchequer smiled with its eyebrows and let the stick join the shelves, a forest that had learned to balance accounts. In the afternoon, new levies were tallied for future retrieval, and a young clerk learned the pressure with which to split a stick so that each half kept its dignity. There was an entire etiquette to the split. Too violent emotion, and the wood would check unpredictably and make the halves complain later by refusing to align. Too timid, and the split wandered off course as if the stick had decided to take a walk across the grain. Old hands used a straight knife and a thin wedge, easing the blade along while pressing the wood to the table with a calm palm. The sound was a mild crackle followed by relief, like a frost breaking under careful boots. This performance took place hundreds of times in busy seasons. The exchequer clerks could have formed a musical ensemble if anyone had asked, bass by splitting treble by the thin chimes of counters on the checker cloth, percussion by quills, tapping inkwells that they rarely needed for tallies, and kept anyway, because quills improve the dignity of a room. Errors happened, as errors do. A clerk might miscount shillings and have to make a corrective nick, called a nicking down, which the stick accepted with the stoicism of furniture. Another might mislabel the destination shire. There were many counties beginning with the letter S, and a tidy alphabet sometimes hides more traps than an untidy one. When confusion threatened, the halves themselves were the witnesses that did not forget. Bring an honest foil and it will shame an incorrect stock by refusing to love it. The sticks aged, and aging made them more themselves. Hazel kept its pale good humor. Willow wore a faint ribboning of grain. Some bore scorch marks from proximity to hearths and chilly offices. Some wore a gloss of the grip end from 100 practical hands. The exchequer tied them in bundles by year, sometimes by tax, and stacked the bundles like well-meaning firewood that would never meet flame. Visitors later reported rooms lined high with tallies, the kingdom's fiscal spine, and shelves of links and notches. To modern eyes, it seems charming and slightly absurd, but the system worked because it did not require trust in ink or signatures, both of which have tempers. It required trust in wood and joinery, which are more predictable. If you imagine a sheriff riding north with a foil tucked into his belt or sewn into a bag, you can also imagine him tapping it occasionally with 2 fingers, a private reassurance that the exchequer and he still agreed. The tap made no noise worth writing down in a chronicle, which is why it happened everywhere. Audits had a craftsmanship too. Twice a year, in sessions called the Michaelmas and Easter terms, officials brought their foils and tallies and went through rituals of presentation. A long table was laid with a cloth squared like a chessboard, the beloved checker and counters, moved across it as sums were rehearsed. The checker cloth allowed non-writers to follow calculations. It was spreadsheet software woven into wool. When the sums reached agreement, a clerk drew the stick, cut the notches, spoke the amount aloud to the room as if narrating a conjuring trick, and split it. The presiding barons of the exchequer, part judges and part managers, watched as the stock found its shelf and the foil found its road. It all sounds grand until you recall that someone still had to sweep up slivers of wood and put the chairs back in their places. The grandest systems depend on people who know where the broom lives. Language accreted around tallies the way lime accretes on kettle elements. To tally became a verb because verbs are opportunists. Stock and foil traveled into other vocabularies, stock as the rooted part, foil as the changeable leaf. Short end of the stick acquired reputations from splits that were not centered. Phrases like cut your losses and square the accounts feel as if they belong here as well, even if the connections are only friendly rumors. Collectors of oddities have tallies with names still readable: John of the Bakery, William of the Marsh, and with amounts that were probably ordinary in their time and therefore very soothing now. A few shillings for a ferry, pence for a bridge, repair, a gravity-defying number of pounds for a royal event that required flags, and another number for the removal of flags when the weather lost interest. The tallies do not tell stories, they tell totals. Totals are stories with punctuation removed, which is how sleep prefers them. Of course, the system was not eternal. Paper grew more confident. Writing achieved a monopoly on paperwork. Ledgers multiplied like contented rabbits. Tallies continued for conservative reasons until the 19th century, when they were finally declared unnecessary and, more to the point, in the way. Offices ordered their disposal. The old sticks, bundled by the millions, were taken to furnaces to be burned as scrap kindling, which is an efficient plan that would have remained wonderfully uneventful if chimneys had been more patient. You may have heard what happened next, told in grand tones in other rooms. Fires became ambitious in buildings. Given an opportunity, behaved like history. Here we will simply say that many tallies returned to the air, and the sky took notes in smoke. The lesson everyone recorded was not about flame, but about tidiness. Any archive, no matter how wooden, prefers a calm exit. Afterwards, ledgers took over without embarrassment, and receipts argued on paper the way wood had once taken for granted. Even when the sticks were gone, the logic persisted. A train ticket torn in half at a gate echoes the stock and the foil. So does a claim check with a matching number on a coat hanger. So does a concert wristband with a tear-off stub that says a person entered a room and will probably leave again, ideally with their coat. Modern barcodes are tallies that became thin and learned to speak in lines. Kerr codes are tallies that discover geometry and enjoy being photographed. When your phone vibrates to confirm a transaction and a server somewhere nods, that electronic nod is the old alignment of halves. The same brief, satisfying fit of information with itself. Even the idea of two-factor authentication has a tally mood to it. You carry one half. The institution keeps the other. The door opens when the halves agree. What has left the scene, but the habit of systems to ask for mirrors has not? If you look for the human in all of this, you find it at the edges. The clerk who preferred hazel because it split honestly. The sheriff who kept his foil in the lining of a saddlebag because that seemed safer than trusting a pocket. The apprentice who miscut a shilling and learned the art of the corrective nick with a blush. The baron of the exchequer who tapped a stock against the table once, twice to think about the calendar before pronouncing it satisfactory. Somewhere a tally was used briefly to prop a window. Somewhere another one stirred gruel because a spoon went missing. Somewhere a child found an offcut on the floor, learned to read notches with fingertips, and later in life trusted numbers that came in shapes. In a museum, you might see a bundle labeled in a handwriting that has retired. The thread is still tied. The knots are small acts of faith in future fingers. Tools for the work still exist as if the office just stepped out. Splitting knives with long, calm blades. Short wedges whose only desire is to be struck once and then hold steady. Bundling cords with the memory of being wrapped. which is a comforting memory for chord. If you place such things on a table and sit with them, you can almost hear the soft arithmetic of wood, which is different from the click of abacus beads and different again from the clatter of keys. And you can imagine one more routine afternoon in a tally office near Michaelmas. Cool air through a narrow window dust motes, discovering sunlight and deciding to perform. A clerk humming a tune that has forgotten its words, and a pile of sticks becoming the kingdom's diary without thinking it is doing anything remarkable. Modern accounts prefer spreadsheets, but the mind still enjoys the sensory competence of older methods. Lined paper stands in for the checker cloth. A pencil's groove on the page is a notch you can rub. When you sign for a package and the scanner beeps, some old muscle along the spine recognizes the moment when halves of a story rejoin. Even receipts still tear, neat little perforations that recreate the logic of stock and foil for a world that loves the word copy. These recreations matter less for nostalgia than for calm. Systems that ask for two agreeing halves are easier to trust in the evening, when thinking is a step slower and reassurance should be tactile. Wood once provided the tactile part. Now we pretend with paper and screens, and it mostly works. But if someone handed you a split stick and asked you to bring back the other half in 6 months, you would carry it with surprising seriousness, and you would find yourself tapping it, without meaning to, when the road ahead of you felt like arithmetic. If you are drifting, picture a quiet storeroom as daylight thins. Bundles of tallies rest in ranks, sleeves of time tied with string. A clerk counts them by touch rather than sight, because touch is how the sticks prefer to be counted. Along the wall, a broom waits like a polite colleague. A small window shows the sky turning ink blue, and in that gentle interval between day and lamp, the wood smells faintly sweet, as if it remembered being tree and just now decided to remember being evidence. The clerk writes a single line in a ledger because paper is allowed to participate. Then he locks the door in a practiced way and carries one newly cut foil to the messenger, who will ride until the next milestone. The messenger tucks the wood away the way one tucks away a sentence that needs to reach the right person. The stick is light. The promise is heavier, and yet, because it has been split, it feels balanced. Tomorrow the other half will sit waiting on a shelf that knows how to wait. The halves will keep each other honest at a distance, which is what good systems do for good sleep. You might not expect the mood of a town to depend on the weight of a loaf, but for a very long time, people slept more easily when they knew tomorrow's bread would balance a scale. The night begins in a bakery that is already dusty with the future. The trough is a low boat, and the dough is the slowest river. The baker leans in with forearms that have learned to weather small storms of flour, and he folds the water into the grain until the mixture stops arguing. Sourdough sits in a shy bowl like a veteran and lends a quiet opinion. Yeast, which is gossip with bubbles, wakes up on schedule. Fire is courted, not summoned, because wood has preferences and brick remembers yesterday's heat. At the door, a peel is leaning, a long wooden oar whose only lake is a quick oven floor. Somewhere a cat has found the warmest tile and decided to help by occupying it. If you're still awake by the time we reach the bit where a public officer taps a loaf and writes down a number smaller than a sparrow, you can subscribe, or you can just let the dough rise without committing to anything. I will keep describing. Crumbs at a speed that respects pillows. Night baking has a calendar separate from the city's. The baker starts when the last tavern yawns. He measures by habit and by hand. A bushel that is a little country, a scoop that is a local hill, a handful that is ancestral. There is a low creak from the kneading bench, the same sound a door makes when it likes you. On the wall, a brush waits for flowering, its bristles complicated with old mornings. The proofing gourds become a parade ground for pale cylinders that pretend not to be important, and the first shovel of coals slides under the vault with the letters hush. Before sunrise, the rules walk in. Medieval and early modern towns were not content to hope for honesty. They codified it in a way that could be weighed. The assize of bread and ale, which has the reassuring name of something both dry and thirsty, tied the loaf to the price of grain with the kind of knot that takes two hands. A penny was not allowed to travel. Instead, the loaf traveled in weight. When wheat was dear, the penny bought a smaller loaf. When grain was generous, the same penny bought one with more opinions. Clerks of the market, searchers, viewers, weighers, officers with titles that sound like verbs in comfortable shoes, kept tables that told them how heavy a farthing loaf should be this week. These tables are the ancestors of price indices, except they smelled faintly of malt and ash and were not required to explain themselves to committees. A baker didn't label price. He labeled compliance. The bread was stamped, not with ink but with a punch or a pen that pressed a mark into the soft skin before baking. Each shop had its own device, a letter, a star, a daisy that had learned geometry. After baking, the marks swelled into clarity and the loaf could be read like a small, warm document. It was the medieval barcode, except it tasted better and did not beep. Inspectors recognized the marks the way neighbors recognized door knockers. Each stood for an address where sleeplessness smelled like toast. Waits were honest until they were tired, which is why the searchers carried scales that were stubborn. They would visit at sensible intervals, sometimes at dawn when the bread was still rehearsing its crust. The logic was tidy. Place a loaf on one side, a set of weights on the other, and let gravity decide whether the baker had honored the week's table or had trimmed it into poetry. If the loaf passed, the officer might press a town seal into the crust, a small civic hug. If the loaf failed, the remedy began with education and proceeded to display. There were pillories for bakers who were repeat poets, and the pillory sometimes dressed the culprit with a defective loaf hung around his neck like a very humble medal. The tumbrel cart carried others through the market in a tour of consequences. That sounded like wheels with opinions. Yet the system also had pity. Because flour is weather and grain is politics, towns adjusted the tables often. Famine law carved exemptions. And the poor received charitable bread called alms loaves, which were heavy not only with flour, but with sentences about duty. It is hard to believe that there were days when a loaf was a law and a comfort at the same time. Meanwhile, inside the bakery, technique was a slow choreography that never once auditioned. The ovens were beehives of brick with memories of every good morning. Heat entered and curved back like a promise. The baker tested temperature the way a violinist tests pitch, by feel and by degree. A handful of flour tossed on the floor of the oven should brown like polite advice. If it blackened, someone had been too enthusiastic with the fire. If it lay pale and confused, the loaves would need to learn patience. Proof dough was slashed with a knife that had a private understanding with gravity. The cuts were not decoration, but breathing instructions. Rye, wheat, maslin, and mixed grains formed their own dialects. A town could be recognized by the way its bread opened. Fancy white loaves existed because bolting cloth knew how to flatter flour by removing bran. Brown loaves existed because the poor insisted on being fed, even when fine cloth was busy somewhere else. Somewhere during this, the apprentice turned the baskets, which is to say he moved them from the colder corner to the warmer, and in doing so he learned weather from bread. When the first batch came out, the sound was a collegial crackle, thousands of tiny statements about moisture and heat agreeing to retire into crust. The baker listened without taking notes. The ear learns the day long before the tongue does. Towns layered supervision on top of ritual in ways that would be comic if they weren't so calm. Ale Connors sipped from small cups and agreed on the sobriety of public beer. Clerks of the market pinched bread and wrote tidy numerals. Beetles walked with staffs that meant "excuse me" in oak. Church wardens counted loaves for distribution after services because charity was supposed to be a schedule, not a mood. Not everything was solemn. In Vienna, a baker pinched a star into a roll and created the emperor's favorite physics, which is how a Kaisersimmel learned to be decorative. In Paris, the white bullet sat on cushions of rumor and aristocracy and occasionally forgot about hunger. In the country, small rye loaves were stored in lofts where they dried into wood and were sliced thin as paper. History's first crisp bread that didn't brag. In London, the brown household loaf fed more people than any title could, carried home in baskets that also carried gossip and sometimes a cat who knew nothing of purchasing but everything of place. Everywhere there were bread knives with serrations like patient teeth because crust is a topography and needs a map. Punishments, when they came, preferred humiliation to drama. A baker who shorted loaves might be placed in the pillory with a rope of stale bread for a cravat and a lesson in the price of underweight, wrapped like a scarf. The tumbril carried another around to laughter that was not completely unkind because everyone knew numbers can be difficult when weather interferes. Fines existed, scales were recalibrated, and occasionally a shop was closed for a holy pause, called reflection. There are cheerful rumors, cheerful in the sense of improbable, about bakers adding stones to loaves to satisfy weight. The stones would confess eventually, and meanwhile the loaf would behave badly in your mouth. More often the cheating was ordinary. Too much water, too little time, a habit of skimming flour that looks generous in a scoop and less so on a scale. The law kept returning to the simple promise, you will not be asked to guess. A coin is a coin and will not change its mind. A loaf is a loaf and will change its size instead. The table will say so. Somewhere, a clerk notched the day's price of wheat into a margin next to the weather. Because wheat has always had opinions about clouds. There were quieter acts of mercy tucked among the measurements. Bakers habitually set aside yesterdays. Bread for the poor, for servants who knew the back door better than the front, for cats who were fond of crumbs soaked in milk, and therefore had the glossy coats of the well-connected. In great houses, trenchers flat, sturdy slices of coarse bread served as plates that politely absorbed sauces and afterwards migrated to the servants' hall or to the owner's basket to be delivered as a second-hand kindness. In monasteries, the weekly collations included bread broken with a care that was part liturgy and part nutrition. In garrison towns, soldiers received rations called billets that were a reliable weight of quiet morale. Sailors got hardtack that was so calm it outlived the voyage. It lasted because it was already a memory of moisture, a biscuit that had concluded all its arguments with water. To keep mice from joining these distributions uninvited, bakers lifted racks and brushed crumbs into a pan whose destination was chickens in alleys that understood economy better than humans ever will. The day after a good baking had its own ecology. Stale bread became a strategy. Cooks invented soups whose chief ingredient was yesterday. Puddings learned that custard can reconcile even the grumpiest crumb. Children chewed heels as if they were spicy. Adults dunked with authority in ale. Wine or broth according to rank and Wednesday. Recipes spoke of thrifty slices, a term that deserves to return. In cities with canals, bakers loaded bread onto barges at dawn in orderly heaps that looked like architecture and delivered it by water to markets where it turned back into appetite. In cities with hills, boys ran loaves up stair after stair and learned the geography of gratitude. Bread returned favors in thousands of tiny ways. A door wedged open with a heel while a bucket was brought in. A pot set on a ring of crust to stop it from grumbling on a table. A shoemaker fed curls of stale crumb to a songbird, which is not an economy but is a system. Everywhere the stamp stayed important. That little depression in the crust was not merely decoration. It was accountability, holding hands with pride. The baker's device said, "We made this, and also, you may complain to us." When the oven sprang the dough and the mark spread into a softened statement, the town could read it across the market. Inspectors read it closer, sometimes rubbing ash from the crust with a thumb that belonged on a coin, but was pleased to be. Here, in times of trouble, short harvests, long wars, the mark could even be mercy. The city authorized a cheaper loaf, declared it by stamping with a different punch, and the market learned overnight how to recognize relief. Bread stamps traveled, with people into other countries the way surnames do. A baker from another town might keep his old device at the back of a drawer and press it once a year into a loaf to remember where. Ambition began dot. By late afternoon, the bakery was a low cloud of quiet. The ash bin had the weight of a conversation. Completed. The wooden paddles leaned against the wall like satisfied oars. Flour bags, folded and stacked, looked like sleeping sails. The baker counted coins by touch and lined them in a small dish next to a sprig of rosemary that kept flies from believing gossip. He set aside a loaf for the midwife who never had change and never needed it, another for the widow who always had thanks and never used it up. A child came in and asked for the smallest end of something. A heel appeared with cunning speed. A tiny stamp was pressed into it with a fingertip. The child went out into a street that had learned to be evening. From the church came a bell that sounded as if it had been hung from a loaf. Bells have always understood the importance of timing. Somewhere, a market officer finished writing a meat number and put down his pen with the relief of a next meal guaranteed. Modern bakeries still inherit this choreography even when the law is different and the tables live secretly in spreadsheets. Digital scales glow with the same stern kindness as brass. Price tags stand in for stamped devices, but pride still travels by crust. Food codes regulate by grams, where clerks once regulated by notches. Auditors wear reflective vests, where beetles wear hats. The lecture is gentler and the forms more numerous. The meaning is unchanged. We will not make you guess. Bakers at 4. In the morning are still philosophers of temperature. Ovens still ask to be respected. Steam still climbs from loaves like a satisfied paragraph. Somewhere a child still requests the smallest end of something and receives generosity folded in two. Heat. Somewhere a city quietly calibrates fairness by the smell that drifts from a doorway. If you are drifting now, let the mind go back to that stamp, a little pressed sign on a crust, the size of a thumbprint, claiming compliance and craft at once. See the searcher's scale with its arms held level, like a town that has made up its mind. Watch the loaf settle on the pan and the weight settle on the other, each finding its height like birds on 2 neighboring branches. Hear the tiny scrape of metal, the scratch of a quill noting a figure that is both arithmetic and mercy. The baker's yes that has the shape of steam. The door will open and close and open again, and each time the smell will follow someone out into streets that trust it. Night will practice arriving. Morning will practice returning. Grains will continue their politics in fields. And between those very grand seasons, there will be the quiet, ordinary treaty of bread and balance. When sleep comes, let it be like a good crumb, even elastic with just enough structure to hold the day until morning asks for a slice. You might not expect the quiet order of an office to depend on a single circle of bent wire, but for well over a century, perfectly calm paperwork has obeyed geometry. A paperclip is not a knot, it is a suggestion held in metal. You slide it. On and 2 sheets decide to behave. The wire has learned a loop that understands tension and will not brag about it. It looks like nothing and acts like patience. Before it arrived, people used pins that committed to puncture, little decisions that left scars in the margins like strong opinions and meeting minutes. Thread was respectable but slow, wax was ceremonial, and straight pins were determined to migrate into fingers. The paperclip appeared with its tidy double turn, and suddenly pages could be temporary friends. If you were still awake by the time we reached the part about wire temper and why the angle at the inner loop matters more than anyone at lunch ever asked, feel free to subscribe or just let the clip sit there, supervising gently while you drift. Early decades of fastening were full of prototypes that looked as if they were trying to remember a coat hanger. Wire was cheap, ductile, and quietly ambitious. Makers tried tongues and hooks and springy spirals with names that sounded like amateur wrestlers. One simple shape won the popularity contest, the familiar double oval you would sketch with two unhurried strokes, often called the gem because it behaved like one without needing to sparkle. Its elegance was accidental mathematics. The outer loop pressed, the inner loop pushed back. The friction settled into a handshake measured in fractions of a millimeter. This is not dramatic engineering, but it works even when the coffee has opinions and the desk has a slope. The wire itself matters more than we admit. Too soft and the clip yawns. Too hard and it acts like a small guillotine for corners. Makers learned to give it a spring temper, a memory of straightness strong enough to pull against being bent, but polite enough not to insist on returning to a line immediately. Zinc or nickel plating kept rust from turning correspondence into archaeology, and occasionally a maker dipped the whole thing in plastic so it could wear colors the way a quiet person tries a bright scarf and then keeps it. The clip's geometry is a study in modest force. When you slide it on, the inner loop flexes a little and stores a breath of energy. That breath presses the sheets together as effectively as a lecture. The clever part is that the wire touches the paper in 4 places, which spreads the burden and refuses to tear. In a pinch, even a bad clip works once, but a good one works repeatedly and forgives rushed motions. It's the difference between kindness and tolerance. People sometimes ask why not a single loop, or a loop with a barb, or a clamp with little teeth. Experience answered patiently. Single loops twist, barbs pretend to be helpful right up until they are not, and teeth belong on mammals. A paperclip's skill is to be temporary without making the temporary feel frail. If you listen closely when you push one home, there is the faintest frictional hiss. Like someone smoothing a sheet on a bed, the clip changed the desk without anyone noticing. Folders could be thinner because metal didn't have to thicken there. Spines with brass split pins and burrs. Letters could be clipped at the top rather than punched at the side, which saved the layout and the mood. The out tray became an ecosystem, small stacks of pages held together by little ovals that knew their job and did it quietly. Even the vocabulary followed. Clipped together became a metaphor for people who were temporarily aligned. Unclip became what you did with a finger and a thought. Somewhere a secretary learned to flick a clip with one hand so it hopped off without bending. This should be a course in business school, but remains a folk art. Somewhere a clerk made chains during a slow hour, linking clip to clip to clip until there was a glittering rope of standardized hesitation stretching across the blotter. Office supplies are how time becomes calm. Standards crept in like cats. Wire gauges settled toward the middle of reason. Links converged until you could count on a clip being the size of a very short sentence. There were jumbo clips for documents that had ambitions, tiny butterfly variants that liked to sit prettily at the top of invitations, and heavy binder clips with black bodies that looked like small tuxedos for stacks that needed a bit of authority. Each kept faith with the original idea. Grip without damage, release without regret. The binder clip, by the way, is a hinge that found its vocation. Its silver arms fold down to look less energetic, and it holds pages with the kind of empathy springs learned from bridges. People buy whole boxes of them intending to be tidy, and then use them to keep chip bags monogamous. Stationery knows its destiny, but is generous with side quests. For a tool so quiet, the paperclip has a public life. It lives in the pockets of security guards and librarians and people who pretend they might need to fix a badge at any moment. It lives in junk drawers where it coils around old rubber bands and a battery that is not quite ready to admit retirement. It lives on refrigerator doors holding takeaway menus with a magnet that was once an advertisement for a plumber who moved away 3 years ago but is still doing his best as a magnet. The clip is humble enough to be an impromptu reset tool for tiny buttons that dislike human fingers, a SIM tray key that most of us misplace the day we open the phone box, and a gentle prod for crumbs in narrow places. It is frequently asked to become a small hook and behaves well, and occasionally asked to be jewelry and behaves beautifully. Some people carry one bent into a bookmark shape, a gesture that says, "I will return," in stainless steel. There are stories that clips helped with courage. During a 20th century occupation, citizens are said to have worn a clip on their lapels as a discreet symbol of resistance. The kind of quiet badge only stationery could invent. Historians point out that myths grow around useful shapes the way ivy grows on patient walls. Even if the exact anecdote is not as tidy as the retelling, the idea persists because it feels right. A clip stands for attachment without injury, for alignment, without puncture, for holding together while allowing removal. It is the emblem of temporary solidarity, which is a very human state. If you ever assemble the papers for a petition, you will reach for one without thinking, and it will perform symbolism without charging a fee. Not all papers appreciate the same clip. The clip's diplomacy is learning who needs what. Thin airmail. Sheets used to prefer gentle wire. Thick cardstock wants a clip with a little swagger. Onion skin carbon copies, crisp as polite leaves, can spring out of the grip unless the clip sits fully home. There is a way to feed a clip so that the long side lies on top of the front page. That way, the short inner loop presses from underneath, and the whole arrangement looks organized from the reader's point of view. You can put a clip on sideways and it will still succeed, but it will feel wrong in a way you can't explain at a meeting. There are people who align the clip with the top left corner because corners deserve company. There are people who center it because balance makes them sigh in relief. There are people who place two modestly spaced as if they were eyebrows. Expressing gentle interest in the agenda. If you watch a tray of incoming mail, you see small physics at work. Envelopes open, hands separate pages, and clips arrive like ushers. The metal takes a tiny bite of alignment, and the stack becomes a conversation instead of a shuffle. Staplers can be authoritative, sometimes too much so. They put holes in the record that future lawyers may sniff at. Clips allow a document to be rearranged, annotated, copied, and restored to its original order with only the marks of approval. When photocopiers grew confident and cheerful, the phrase "remove all clips" appeared on plastic signs taped to hoods by technicians who had learned that feeders eat metal with an expensive crunch. Yet even there, the clip helped by being obvious to removal. Tape is an adhesive that pretends it never happened while leaving a shadow. Clips make their presence obvious, then step aside. The clip's afterlife is full of second jobs. When paperwork thins, they hold tea bags to strings. While the cup performs steeping, they become hooks for ornaments when a holiday tree is suddenly ambitious. They mark cable labels on router tangles, a tiny loop embracing a tag that stops you from unplugging the wrong enthusiasm. They can be springs for modelers and hinges for school projects, and tiny stands for postcards that prefer to stand up without. Leaning on an heirloom vase. People have used them to press tiny reset holes on routers that forgot themselves, to coax a jammed zipper into remembering its duty, to fish a fallen earring from a floor register with a loop and a whisper of triumph. We could list 20 more uses and still not exhaust the clip's willingness to be useful in silence. It is an object that believes in being invited. Manufacturing never seeks applause, but the clip line has a rhythm that could lull a stadium. Wire unspools from drums as tall as an honest mistake, runs through straighteners that frown at kinks, and meets forming dies that gesture left, right, left, like a conductor coaxing a small orchestra to behave. In a fraction of a second, the wire is convinced into shape and snipped. A hopper catches the result and sounds like piano keys dropping onto felt. Plating happens in long baths, zinc, nickel, where the clips pretend to be pickles marinating. For civility, drying drums roll with the sound of many decisions being finalized. Quality control is a person whose fingers can feel a burr more reliably than cameras can see one, and a person who knows when a coil has lost its temper because good clips feel springy to logic but not to rudeness. They are boxed in counts that are always round numbers because round numbers are soothing, 100 to a small box, an amount that says you can clip for a while. Even the failures teach a soft lesson. Bent out clips become tools. Broken ones become experiments in geometry on idle afternoons. A clip that has lost its spring can still be a bookmark or a key tag, or the thing you throw across a desk to make a point without making a sound. Rusty clips leave faint orange commas on paper and are gently retired. Plastic-coated ones discolor, then continue working anyway because dignity is part of their metallurgy. Somewhere someone still has a novelty clip shaped like a treble clef. That holds nothing well and looks pleased about it. It lives in a pen cup and contributes morale. That is labor too. The paperless office arrived without quite evicting paper. Screens do much of the shuffling now, but humans continue to print for meetings because eyes rest better on actual fibers, and because pens turn thoughts into diagrams with a speed that keyboards resent. Clips attend these moments like ushers, who do not judge. They sit on the edge of agendas and keep handouts in sets for people who wandered in late. When the meeting breaks, clips migrate into pockets to be discovered hours later with a sort of metal surprise. At home, they are released into bowls near doors where keys, foreign coins, and a button that belongs to no garment build a quiet community of retrieved items. A clip can live there for a year, then suddenly be exactly what is needed to corral warranty receipts before a polite call to a manufacturer. It forgives the delay. Some people collect them. It sounds implausible until you see a tray of variations. Gems with square corners and round corners, old copper-plated ones, clips with tiny rolled ends so they will not nick paper, heart-shaped gifts from a conference that promised networking and delivered stationery, binder clips in improbable colors that make spreadsheets feel festive, archaic spring clips that look like the future imagined by a century that never met. Wi-Fi. Each design is a minor claim about how pages prefer to be held. The classic design wins most days because minimalism is not fashion. It is physics with manners. The clip participates in ritual too. A student turning in a paper clips the pages, straightens the top edge with a precise little tap, and suddenly the work feels complete in a way staples cannot imitate. A lawyer walks into a quiet courtroom with a stack of exhibits, each clipped, rather than punched because someday a different stack will need to be made. An archivist slides a non-reactive plastic clip onto a bundle of letters that have survived campaigns, marriages, and a heroic misunderstanding about attic climate control. Names go on the corner, the clip goes on the names. The folder goes into the box. The box goes into a room that knows how to be 60 degrees forever. The clip, which was stamped from a drum of wire on a Tuesday afternoon, while someone on the line thought mainly about lunch, has joined posterity by accident. No one tells it. It would be embarrassed. If you're drifting, picture a desk at closing time. The last email has been printed not because it needed ink, but because someone wanted to put a finger on it tomorrow. A small stack of reports, staggered, like calm rooftops, waits for morning. A clip sits on each, silver ovals aligned like moons. The lamp goes out with a soft sound. And in the half-light, the clips hold their little jurisdictions without calling attention to themselves. Somewhere else, in a factory that is also going to sleep, the wire drums sit and do their cylinder impression. A night watchman passes and the clips do not move. They were designed to stay exactly like this. Togetherness by tension, order without wounds, readiness that creaks almost imperceptibly when you touch it. Tomorrow, fingers will lift them with that small, confident pinch thumb on top loop, forefinger under inner loop, and the documents will sigh into motion. New pages will be added, and the clip will make room the way a hospitable chair makes room for a coat. Later, when the matter is settled, the clip will be released and will straighten itself as if pleased that you noticed. Some will walk away on pockets. Some will retire to the magnet cup. One will be rebent into a star during a long call, and then rebent again into usefulness because mercy is a loop you can do twice. None of them will complain. They are content to be the quietest hinge in the office, the smallest promise to keep things together until you decide otherwise. If sleep interrupts before the last paragraph learns its point, the clips will go on making sense in the dark, which is a good job for small metal ovals that invented calm by bending once and meaning it. You might not expect a forest to hide inside a chest of tiny drawers, but that is how libraries kept their trees pressed flat into cards, trimmed to a standard size and taught to stand in single file. The card catalog sits there like a friendly beehive, lacquered wood soft at the edges from a century of fingertips, each drawer wearing a brass smile with an oval pole and a little rectangle for a label that has had many lives. Open one and the cards shiver politely, a pale rustle like distant rain on paper roofs. The first card is a guide, a stiff soldier bearing a capital letter with the authority of a lighthouse. Behind it, quiet citizens in alphabetical order wait to be retrieved. The rods through their hearts are there for modesty, they keep that. Cards from leaping out in moments of excitement, and when you twist the rod and free a stack, the whole drawer exhales. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about abbreviated centimeters and the agreeable sound a date stamp makes when it has a low opinion of urgency, feel free to subscribe. Or simply leave the drawer half open in your mind and let the cards hold your place. They will not mind. They were hired to remember. A catalog card is a small apartment for facts. Across the top lives the author's name, last name first, as if the catalog enjoys introductions that begin with surnames. Beneath it, the title walks in, capitalized with restraint, followed by the place of publication, the publisher's name, and the year, all of it typed in a monospaced voice that suggests the typewriter wore spectacles. There are abbreviations that look like polite gestures. IL for illustrated port, for portraits, CM for height, as if the book were being measured for a new hat. Occasionally maps appears, which always feels like a promise, and sometimes index, which feels like an apology that arrives on time. In the corner, the classification number settles like an address. If the library uses Dewey, it is a neighborhood built on 10s 500s for science, 800s for literature, a warm apartment called 641.5 where cookbooks live and smell like imaginary cinnamon. If the library lives in the Library of Congress world, letters lead you down long corridors, P for language, N for art, TK for electrical engineering, which is both a letter and a hum. The card doesn't announce preferences. It simply points the way a good street sign points without extracting a fee. Filing rules are a sleepy arithmetic. You put authors in order by last name, then by first, then by middle, as if elegance were a sequence. Titles without authors begin their lives alphabetically under the first significant word, which is why the becomes invisible and history ends up with more neighbors than it knows what to do with. Particles like D and von have their own delicate etiquette, the kind that could start an argument and never does because librarians make tea instead. Punctuation is not decorative, it is a system of traffic lights. A period means a stop and a nod. A semicolon means the conversation continues with better posture. In older catalogs, some cards are written in a tidy hand that knew penmanship as an oath, the black ink slightly browned by years into a friendly tea color. Others are typescript, occasionally with the letter O that bites the page a little. Too hard. If you look closely, you can see corrections made by ghosts, a caret inserting a missing R, a faded stamp crossed out with pencil and replaced with a new date, the book equivalent of quietly moving a teacup closer to the saucer. The drawers have personalities. The one under F always sticks because at some point the floor dipped a fraction of a centimeter and nobody wanted to accuse the building of slouching. S is heavy because Smith is unstoppable, and also because science and society are both convinced they are the larger idea. Q is featherlight and behaves like a polite guest. Someone once slipped a postcard between two cards, a decade-old recommendation for a novel about a lighthouse, and the catalog, being generous, has held on to it as if it were an honorary citizen. When a book is missing, a crimson out card with a due date stands in its place, a paper silhouette that promises return. Sometimes the silhouettes multiply like patient geese, and that is how you know a book has been busy. The brass rods that secure stacks make a tiny chime when removed and replaced, a sound that could be recorded and sold to people who need reassurance that order exists. Some cards are cross-references, an act of intellectual matchmaking. See, also, they say, in small caps that are never urgent and always wise. They direct you from caterpillars to Lepidoptera, from seaweed to marine algae, from Rhodes Roman to Rome Communications, which is exactly the kind of sentence that persuades you to sit down. Subject headings insist on an agreed vocabulary, the way families settle on pet names. The catalog prefers automobiles to cars, not because it's snobbish, but because it wants every road to end at the same garage, in multilingual. Collections, cards duplicate themselves in new alphabets. Cyrillic sampling the drawer like snow, Arabic flowing right to left with the imperturbable grace of a river that knows where the sea is. The rods accept every script without comment. Wood is famously pluralistic. You take a card to the stacks like a map that has opinions. The classification number becomes a riddle answered by shelving. 813.52 means American fiction of a specific generation. QC 173.98 whispers about relativity in a way that makes you walk more carefully. The stacks breathe cool air, humming lightly because all serious buildings hum. Along the aisles, shelf labels show progress in small numbers and you pass through. Them like ours. Books lean not randomly, but conspiratorially, each a little angle of history. The book you want may not be where it should be, but it is almost always near where it should be, a kind of affectionate disobedience. You learn to scan neighboring spines, the way one looks around in a room for a friend who has stepped away only far enough to greet a biscuit. The moment of finding is quiet and complete. A finger's width of cardboard gives way, the book slides free, and the dust jacket, if it has one, crackles as if it had been saving that sound for you before computers came to sit in the lobby. With their glowing eyebrows, most libraries practice the art of the charge slip. Inside the front cover is a pale pocket with a card nested in it, the same size as the catalog cards wearing another job title. The card lists author, title, and call number. It has lines for borrower numbers. It judges no one. At the desk, the librarian withdraws the card, flips open a date due stamp, and brings it down in a gentle thump that registers deep in the carpet. The stamp's ink is the blue of reasonable sky. The date is both promise and prophecy. It goes. On the card, on the pocket, and sometimes on a slit tucked like a bookmark for the borrower's refrigerator. This choreography takes under 10 seconds and will live in the handwriting of many afternoons. If a patron returns a book late, the stamp performs an encore and a fine is recorded in numerals that resemble rain. Somehow the sound of the stamp is always louder when you are late. Borrower numbers were once metal tabs, once typed slips, once names written carefully in ledgers with columns as straight as sermons. The ledger entries age like good bread, dry at the edges, still nourishing if you care to read them. People who move away sometimes send back cards that have traveled with them for years, a small migrating bird returning to its card-sized nest. Others keep them as souvenirs because it is pleasant to own an object that promises future afternoons. During heavy weather, the desk keeps a pencil with a string attached because pencils wander. The string is not a punishment, but a reminder that the library is a community of hands. The librarian wears the gentlest expression available anywhere, the expression of someone who knows where everything lives and is not. Impressed by the concept of hurry-dot rules are present but soft. Silence is a direction, not an edict. It lives on signs the size of a thoughtful envelope. Food is discouraged except when the librarian looks at your bag of almonds and decides the greater good is to let the day go well. Children get their own. Shelves lower down where the spines say, "Read me," with louder colors. On rainy afternoons, a coat rack feels like a harbor with umbrellas that silently agree not to trickle. If you sit in an armchair and fall asleep with a book tinted on your chest, the librarian does not wake you. When you wake, the book will still be there, and the clock will have leaned forward a quarter hour in sympathy. The card catalog develops customs around the edges. A little pencil cup appears at the corner with golf pencils that grow shorter as semesters advance. Next to it, scratch slips for call numbers are cut from used paper because there is virtue in turning memos into maps. People try their hands at the typewriter for interlibrary request cards and discover that the ribbon has been living a long life and deserves retirement. The librarian pats it, which helps somehow. Patrons become experts at alphabetization without meaning to. The drawer for M is a teacher in its own right. Mac comes before MC in most systems, but not all, and somewhere an argument is resolved with a shrug that sounds like wood sliding quietly home. Eventually, the glowing eyebrows arrive. Terminals. Barcodes become a new language of consent. Each book is given a white label with lines that look like a very organized zebra. The scanner beeps, a sound 3 notes higher than the date stamp thunk, and without the perfume of ink. Borrowers receive plastic cards with barcodes of their own, the new talismans. Despite the change, the old choreography survives in disguise. Instead of removing a slit from a pocket, the librarian scans 2 barcodes, and the computer writes the same promise the stamp once wrote. The due date prints on a receipt that curls at the corner as if reminiscing about pockets. Holds are printed on slips that sit inside the books like a temporary soul. The carts multiply. They wear rubber wheels that prefer carpet and have shelves slanted back, just enough to keep books from practicing escape. Everything moves faster and ends up in the same place. RFID arrives and makes the books ring like secrets for a moment when passing a gate that looks like a friendly sculpture. Self-check stations teach patrons to perform the borrowed ritual on themselves. Nothing about it is complicated, but people pretend at first that it is, and then proceed with the confidence of magicians. The old card catalog sits a while, hands folded. Some libraries retire it with speeches and cookies. Some let it linger like an older relative who still knows everyone's birthday. Drawers are rehomed as jewelry chests, seed libraries, craft compartments for buttons that rejoice in being sorted. A few stay, half sentimental, half practical, filled with local history files and pamphlets about festivals that happen precisely on the 3rd. Saturday in a month that is always optimistic about rain. The rods still work. The drawers still exhale. You begin to notice how many tiny decisions hold a library together. Shelf reading is meditation disguised as tidying. A student goes down a row, murmuring, point 3 before point 32, C before D, and leaves the world better than she found it. Book trucks have a typography oversize on the bottom, paperbacks on the top, and roll as gently as good nurses. Repair tape sits in a drawer like an ambulance that hopes for boredom, ready to rescue spines that have had structural opinions. New book smell lives near the circulation desk. Old book smell lives everywhere else, a perfume of lignin and patient dust that explains itself to anyone who has ever opened a box in an attic and felt time shift. The copier tries to become a character, but is denied stardom. Still, it remembers every coin and every jam. The fish in the lobby tank believe they work there and do not charge overtime dot in the reading room. Sunlight falls in rectangles across. Tables polished by elbows. Lamps with green shades lean over pages with the manners of chaperones. A pencil scrapes softly, the most polite sandpapering imaginable. Two scholars exchange whispers about a footnote that has misplaced itself. A drama no theater would stage, and yet very satisfying. Someone in a corner is discovering the joy of an index that uses small capitals in a way that suggests that emphasis can be a form of affection. At exactly the moment you thought about tea, a kettle in the staff room clicks off and the smell of something comforting drifts into the doorframe and decides to stay there. Even returns have a ceremony. The book drop receives after-hours confessions with a thump that measures honesty in book weight units. Mornings begin with a librarian, kneeling to open the drawer and lift the night's arrivals the way a baker lifts loaves. Each gets a scan, a sigh, a place. If a title is on hold for someone, a pale slip appears, folded into the cover like a courteous handshake. Shelves and back hold promises alphabetized by surname. When you come to collect, the book slides forward, with the air of a commuter who knows the right platform. Overdues send emails in a tone that is disappointed but not cruel. Most people pay fines like tithes to order and feel better afterwards. The reference desk retains magic that the internet cannot imitate because the internet does not make eye contact. Ask a question about municipal fountains or the average speed of a housefly, and the librarian will lead you to a shelf where a book that nobody has checked out in 9 months sits with exactly your sentence inside. An atlas opens with a sigh. A statistical abstract appears like a saxophone solo for numbers. A multi-volume encyclopedia of things with wings explains all creatures whose names begin with night. The desk also dispenses directions to restrooms, pencils, and the location of the nearest outlet with a stoicism that borders on the heroic. When the day gives itself to evening, the catalog drawers close one by one with a padded syllable. Chairs tuck in. A final patrol of the stacks adjusts a few spines that lean too far into conversation. The clock in the hall decides graciously to be 5 minutes fast, so patrons will not test the door and their luck at the same time. Outside, the sky turns, the color of a blue cloth cover. Inside, the desk prints a list of tomorrow's holds, and the printer curls it like a sleeping cat. The last lights click off in sequence, a dimming that whispers along the shelves. The last staff member looks back to make sure nothing is conspiring to be on fire, a professional habit that libraries never resent. If you are drifting now, let yourself walk, unhurried, to the catalog one more time. Slide out a drawer, feel. The cards lean against your fingers. See the little alphabet of a whole city's reading waiting to be asked. Imagine taking a single card and following it through the day. Down the aisles, past the fans that turn like contented ideas, into the hands of someone who did not know they needed exactly this page until they felt its weight. The card will go back to its slot and the book to its shelf, and the reader to a chair by a window where the late sun is already practicing its exit, the drawer will close. The label on the brass pole will shine with the minor pride of a job known and done. The forest of tiny rectangles will remain in order until morning, when the first hand of the first patron of the day will wake the first card by simply touching it, and the whole place will remember again how to be quiet and generous at once. You might not expect the soft order of a city to depend on a bronze bowl swinging above its roofs, but for a very long time the day listened to a bell before it listened to anything else. At first light, a rope moved in a tower, and a circle of metal answered with a note that went everywhere at once, over market stalls being set up with sleepy resolve, across courtyards where cats were finishing negotiations with birds, along alleys where bread smell rehearsed its entrance. The ring did not tell you what hour it was so much as it let you know that a new one had begun, and that this hour, unlike the last, expected your cooperation. Monasteries made a profession of this cooperation. Their hours came with names that felt like steps, the night psalms that learned to be awake, the praises at dawn, the tidy stack of prime, terse sext and nun, the kitchen-sounding vespers, and the final good night called Compline that looked after door latches and souls equally. The bell was the scheduler, the app, the reasonable voice clearing its throat. Monks used water clocks and candle clocks to avoid guessing, and a brother, with a good ear, learned to keep a float or a wick exactly where it ought to be. When the wind frowned and pushed sound away, someone went up the stair and rang longer, because nothing important happens without a person deciding to climb a narrow stair and do it. If you're still awake when we arrive at the part about how a tower custodian rubbed tallow on a rope so it would glide politely through his hands, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the bell keep time for both of us while your thoughts float like pigeons who know very well where home is. Watchman copied. The habit. They walked at night with halberds that were more conversation than threat, and called the hours so the street would know that someone had counted all the way to 3. Their voices traveled differently than metal, dipping into doorways, rounding corners, making courtyards feel included. All's well, they explained, in case the roofs were wondering. In cold weather, the call carried farther, and in hot weather, it carried resentment at mosquitoes, but the hours did not mind. Bells learned codes for danger-fast strokes for fire, slow strokes for funerals, patterns for warnings that belonged to that town and nowhere else. The first mechanical clocks crept into towers like practical cats. They were extravagant boxes of iron with teeth and levers and an escapement that behaved like a patient heartbeat. Weights drove them, not springs, and the weights needed gravity the way a story needs paragraphs. A caretaker wound them with a long crank while thinking about bread or politics. The clock knew only the hour at first, because minutes were a luxury of people with nothing else to do, and most people had something else to do. The bell struck the hour because the face was high and unreadable at night, and because sound is kind to distance in ways numerals are not. Some faces had only one hand and looked proud of it. In a few Italian towns, the dial numbered all the way to 24, as if the day were not divided, but simply tall. The towers made theater out of punctuality. Automata bent themselves to the hour with modest self-importance. Little men struck their tiny hammers. Gilded roosters unfolded patience with wings. Grim skeletons tugged on ropes with a gentle conviction of memento mori that had learned showmanship. The quarter hour picked up tunes and began to play them. Carillons rehearsed sequences of notes that belonged to seasons and civic events. In Flanders, whole squares learned to expect melody whenever the cloud of bells decided it was time. Beneath the music, the mechanism continued its temperate grinding, a mill for time, the teeth of wheels meeting like friends who never run out of conversation. Wind pushed iron a little, frost made oil consider opinions. The keeper listened with his ear against the case and could tell when a very small lever wanted sympathy. People arranged their days around these reliable noises. Tanners rinsed hides. At the 8 o'clock stroke, bakers aimed for the second quarter after dawn. Somewhere a barber picked up his razor at the noon bell because the light was good and the clients were talkative. You could set your shadow by the tower, though the sun would argue. In each town the hour was local, and when you rode 30 miles east, the same bell would be. Honest about a different noon dot, this local honesty made for charming confusion. Noon was when the sun said it was noon, which is a fine principle until a letter begins to travel by stagecoach and wants to catch a connecting coach in a town whose sun is just a little decisive. People manage for centuries with what you might call good manners and arithmetic. A traveler asked, the innkeeper shrugged in a helpful way. The coachman held up 2 fingers and made a small circle with his hand to mean about. A pocket sundial with a string for a gnome on might make an appearance from a waistcoat. Sandglasses timed sermons because sermons enjoy being timed, and they also timed sailors' watches at sea because a ship needs hours as much as it needs. Wind. In winter, the bell for evening sounded earlier, in summer later, and no one accused the tower of inconsistency. It was the sky's habit, and also how agriculture forgave clocks. Towns developed a bedtime for fire called the curfew, which had more to do with hearths than with teenagers. The word means to cover the fire, a domestic act made into public safety. The bell for curfew is a soft order to put a lid on sparks, close the shutters, make embers polite. A child could fall asleep anywhere to that sound. It was darkness practicing. Being responsible. The curfew bell still rings in a few places, a survival that makes the evening feel ancient without trying. Some towers kept more than one bell and let their voices negotiate among themselves, big ones making statements, small ones commenting helpfully. The whole tower like a family that has practiced mealtime for a long time and knows who says grace and who will bring the bread. Every ring had a personality. Some were sharp as coins, some were mellow as dinner, some had a crack, which is not quite a complaint. More the vocal Gulanaviskar in towns learned to love the imperfection because it sounded like them. In houses, time came indoors and began to wear wood. The long case clock that tall, polite acquaintance with a forehead of glass sit in halls where boots dried and letters waited. Its pendulum wrote an essay in the air at the rate of 1 sentence per second. Weights descended with optimism, and a hand ticked around a face that had flowers painted in corners for company. Families wound on Sundays, giving the clock a turn like feeding a horse. For a long time, the hand for minutes was ceremonial. Then it became necessary, and the second hand joined the party with the energy of a relative who arrives late and asks where everyone put the games. On fireplaces and mantels, little carriage clocks carried springtime in their springs and smiled at visitors. Pocket watches begged to be listened to, and their owners obliged, holding them to the ear with a solemnity that you might reserve now for the last percolate of a coffee machine in a quiet kitchen people built winding into their bedtime. A watch. On the dresser with the chain curled like a contented cat. A clock with its key under the base. A routine of gentle turns completed by a small click that meant tomorrow had been invited. The click was the everyday version of ceremony. If you forgot, the morning told you by being too quiet. There were little benches and workshops where mainsprings were coaxed back into temper by people who understood springs and tempers. Railroad. Men checked watches against the station clock because trains are allergic to vagueness. Factories adopted whistles that stood in for bells when steam wanted a voice. The noon whistle blew. Lunch forgot to be theoretical. Work resumed on the minute, even if nobody asked it to. Time began speaking in the plural. Minutes and hours multiplied into shifts. Timetables, office hours, opening times printed on glass. Closing times enforced by broom, the world tried to agree on what time meant without being unkind to sunsets, and the negotiation took a century of polite letters and a few decisive conferences. Railways forced the issue the way a full teapot forces a tray to be sturdy. Trains need an answer, not a poem. Telegraph lines permitted noon from one place to be announced everywhere else as a sort of traveling angel of agreement. In ports, time balls rose each day and fell on the second. A ship in the harbor looked up and set its chronometer, a quiet piece of theater that made longitude possible. In cities, a noon gun spoke one syllable a day and said now, which is the kind of clear speech everyone appreciates at least once every 24 hours. Offices set their clocks by the gun and felt philosophical. The effect was not instant, but it was contagious. Noon synchronized, then 1 o'clock, and eventually the rest of the hours admitted they might as well go along. The 20th century carried the bell indoors and made it electric. Telephones acquired dials, then tones, then voices that would tell you the time with sincere commitment whenever you asked, especially if you were testing a new phone and wanted to be sure it could hear. Radio invented time signals, a chain of beeps that sounded like a very disciplined cricket in united kitchens across a country in the act of resetting. People synchronized by listening together to an invisible pendulum in the air. Wristwatches became waterproof, shockproof, anti-magnetic, polite, immodest, and finally so confident they stopped asking you to wind them. Quartz arrived and settled. The matter with vibrations too fast for patience. Once seconds were that precision, the minutes sat up straight. Somewhere in a laboratory, a beam of light told a group of atoms to calm down. And they did, and that became the heartbeat of their devices. Followed a choir with a conductor no one could see, and yet towers still rang because people liked their past to continue talking in the square. Bell towers changed jobs without resigning. Before loudspeakers learned to carry concerts, the balcony under the bells was a stage for every announcement. That needed a roof. Election results came to the air from there, as did warnings of weather and celebrations that no one knew how to decorate yet, such as an unexpected treaty or someone's generous idea about milk. During wartime, bells practiced silence as patriotism, which is a difficult devotion for a bell. Afterward, they rang again and discovered that joy is heavier than bronze. Carillons took up weekly recitals at twilight. The player inside sat at a bench with levers that looked like oars and wore gloves without fingers. When he pulled, the bells spoke. When he released, they listened. Whole neighborhoods learned a Tuesday melody that migrated into seasons and stood for civic patience. Birds perched on the sound and did not fall off. Children counted the strokes without seeing the numbers, and that is how the brain learns to love time. Striking codes persisted in personal ways. In some towns, the bell would toll in a pattern for a person who had died age counted in strokes, perhaps, or a special pause for a midwife or a school teacher so the community could hear whose absence had begun. In others, the bell marked weddings, with an optimism that even the weather liked. A few rings remained purely practical. A hill village rang to warn of fog rolling in, the tone muffled by the very thing it announced. A coastal town rang one deep note if waves were too ambitious for small boats, a slow admonition to leave courage at home and make soup instead. The bell tower kept remembering people and their errands, even as everyone bought phones that were very proud of themselves. A funny thing about time is that it still needs a caretaker even when it is digital. The server in the basement has a clock that checks with a larger clock that checks with an even larger clock that listens to atoms humming. And yet a human walks through once a week to see whether the fan sounds healthy. Roadside signs flash the hour because drivers like to be reassured they are not being careless with minutes, that someone still changes them after a power failure and presses a small button with a paper clip. In kitchens, the microwave keeps more accurate time than the titans of Renaissance astronomy ever dreamed, and nobody trusts it. They check the oven, then the phone, then the wall clock with the small bird that leans out and complains on the hour. Like a relative with punctual opinions, the bell tower, prominent and analog, presides over all these arguments without taking sides. Night changes the conversation but does not silence it. Somewhere a church strikes the hour in the small hours when not even cats are ambitious, and the sound carries over roofs like a sentence that has learned to whisper. A hospital counts minutes in monitors that are doing their best. A station flashes departure boards that believe morning is possible. A bakery, which in every era has always been exempt from sensible sleep, sets dough to proof and waits for the first payload of 5. Bells now 5. They ring it with a kind of sympathy that suggests someone in the tower is awake and thinking kindly of bread. Somewhere a clerk puts the finishing ellipses on a spreadsheet and realizes the clock on his screen has rolled over the numbers with the smoothness of a new stone. He saves, he stands. The second hand continues. If you visit a tiny museum set, up in the base of a tower, you may find a wooden drum bristling with pins, the program for a chime that plays a hymn in spring and a market tune in harvest and a carol in winter. The custodian will explain that the drum turns a notch each quarter hour and that the songs live in the positions of those pins the way birds live in hedges. You will nod and think about hedges and also notice fingerprints on the brass where people have adjusted the tune with secular reverence. You may also see old bell ropes retired to a corner, fuzzed with use, ends whipped neat with twine, the color of honey. They look like stories you could climb. In a glass case, a pendulum bob rests heavy as a decision, and a placard explains that a clock chooses honesty by how long the pendulum wants each swing to be. This is the kind of honesty everyone can live with. And because the day likes to finish where it began, picture evening in a square where the bell still tells truth. The sun slides away with a confidence earned from millennia of showing up on time. The stall boards tilt and lean like people who have found a bench. Someone, somewhere up the stair, takes hold of the rope because the mechanism is old and polite and appreciates human attention. The first stroke falls and the air becomes organized. Windows open so ears can participate. Dogs decide not to be offended. The first stroke is not lonely. It is the announcement of counting. Everyone after it is a citizen. The sound spreads out over roofs and laundry, into kitchens where onions practice being sweet in pans, into rooms where laptops give up and close, past the river where water pretends it can't hear and then admits it can. It does not tell you what to do next. It only says that the hour is here and that hours are a good way to become tomorrow without getting lost. If sleep borrows you before the count is done, the bell will finish without complaint and keep the rest of the night neatly. Stacked until morning asks for the first note again.